I'm Amandeep Bangu, your host. Now, I first came to the UAE when I was reporting for the BBC. Fast forward, and Abu Dhabi is now my home and a base to travel from for my international journalism. But while global travel is still very much restricted for many of us, festivals like this are a brilliant way for us to celebrate the power of books. And books, they allow us to be transported around the world, to time travel, and also to meet people from all walks of life, real and imagined. I'm pleased to say my guests today are very much real, and joining me here on stage is His Excellency Omar Saif Gabash, the United Arab Emirates Assistant Minister for Culture and Public Diplomacy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's also served the country as ambassador to Russia and France, a businessman, a philanthropist of the arts, which we're going to hear a lot about, and a writer as well, which we're certainly going to be delving into. And joining us from Norfolk, UK, is Justin Marozzi, and a critically acclaimed British historian, journalist like myself, travel writer, author of 8 books. His latest book has just come out this week, now, or I should say this month. We can't get a hard copy of that just yet, but we've got a hard copy of his penultimate book, which we'll be going into with Justin. And I should add that he's traveled extensively in the Middle East, a region he's written about at great length over, I think, 8 books. And he's also a communications advisor to governments, notably in post-conflict environments. So brilliant conversation ahead of us. Please join me in giving both of our guests a very warm welcome.
You want to give me a call?
And welcome to you joining us online. Please do submit your questions. We'll be taking questions towards the end of the session. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got these questions prepared, but I'm just thinking, in this pandemic, we're all feeling a little bit socially distanced. We're certainly feeling quite socially distanced here on stage, and Justin's taken social distancing to another level. I'm glad he is joining us. I'm just going to ask for a little bit of connection with our guests first of all, before we delve into the books and delve into the questions. Your Excellency, I hear that you've just recently returned from Switzerland. Give us a little bit of an idea about the personality behind the very impressive titles. Tell us about your time in Switzerland and what were you reading during the pandemic?
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. And Amandeep, please, I thought we agreed you were going to call me Omar from now on. No?
At your wish.
Yeah, I spent a wonderful time in Switzerland. I absolutely love the country. I got to read, actually, Gore Vidal, of all things. I read a couple of his books. They took forever, but it introduced me to Buddhism for some reason. There's one of his books tackles issues of creation. I think it's actually called Creation. So that was fascinating.
Intriguing. Okay, one for the reading list. And Justin, welcome. Thank you for joining us from Norfolk. Same question for you. I hear that you've just recently returned from Mali. Tell us about that trip and what's been on your reading list.
Well, lovely to join you, and many thanks for having me today.
Oh, we're having a little bit of trouble with hearing you, Justin, so we're just going to make sure your sound is working, and then we're going to come back to you in just a moment. While we just check your sound, I'm just going to ask Omar, where are you hoping to travel to next?
I was actually thinking of going to Mali as well, but to the Maldives, not the sub-Saharan African country. And that was a question whether you had gone to the Maldives or elsewhere.
So maybe we can ask Justin when the sound is back up. I'm just going to wait for Yeah, brilliant, fantastic. So yes, please, Justin, tell us about Mali and what was on your reading list.
Yeah, thanks very much, and lovely to be with you. I hope I don't come across as being half asleep. I flew overnight from Mali, and extremely hot, pushing 40, 45 degrees. A coup was ongoing while I was there, so quite testing time. But I was reading a couple of books, one by my friend, the design critic Stephen Bailey, who's written a very amusing parody of design. And then completely different, a fantastic new book by Ben Kimberley, former SAS soldier, about his memoirs as from soldiering and getting into all sorts of scrapes and adventures.
Quite a diverse collection of books there. Thank you so much for giving us that insight. I feel like I'm living vicariously through both of your travels. I should probably add that I did get a chance to do a little bit of traveling earlier this year to India, but pre the recent surge, and of course our thoughts go out to people across the world who have been affected by the pandemic and continue to be. On that slightly humbling reality check about the pandemic world we're living in and the restrictions that still remain. Only last month, a UN official described COVID-19 as an inequality virus because it's exacerbated the existing vulnerabilities in our economies and societies. Here in the UAE, Amar, if I can bring you in on this point, of course, the rate of vaccination administration has been one of the highest in the world. I've admired the fact that the highly organized handling of the pandemic domestically has also been matched by a very generous and highly organized and effective humanitarian effort globally. It'd be great to get your insight from behind the scenes, what you can share with us about the leadership, how they took that very active role very early on when other countries were still trying to catch up.
Yeah, thank you. It is very impressive, and you know, it's sort of, on a daily basis we discover more and more about how quickly leadership in the Emirates reacted to COVID-19. I think it was already in January of last year we'd set up a committee to tackle the issue, and before many other countries had even realized that there was something happening. I think that's partly related to our very strong relationship with the Chinese government. And the Chinese people. So, but it was also an example of how effectively we can manage sort of issues that pop up out of nowhere. COVID-19 is not a run-of-the-mill pandemic. It's not a run-of-the-mill issue. And I'm just impressed with the way in which we tackled both sort of the vaccination, the testing of vaccines, and the vaccination program itself. We've also managed to keep the country open to tourism, which is a huge money earner for us, and it's incredibly important for our economy, while also making sure that people are safe. So for some reason we got the balance right. I'm not sure why, but we'll learn a great deal about it as we look back.
And again, learning about the local production of the vaccination here in this country and the efforts to help distribute it globally. Yeah. I think that's very encouraging.
I was speaking to some Latin American ambassadors in New York a couple of days ago online, and the Emirates has provided Latin America with 190 tons of PPE equipment, and that's something remarkable. The Emirates has always been giving to other countries, especially in times of need. But the other thing is that the Emirates is now a global logistics hub working with the UN on distributing aid to other countries. We do have an agreement, I think, with Sinopharm to set up a vaccine facility here, and I'm sure that if things go right, we'll have other vaccine facilities as well.
Thank you so much for that insight. I really appreciate that behind the scenes walk through the response. Justin, of course, I'm going to bring you in at this point because you've sensed the kind of the journalistic line have gone down. But let's put our bookworm hats on at the moment. And as I mentioned, we've got your penultimate book, Arab Conquest, has just come out this month. But before we delve in to your wonderful writing, I just really want to hear about how you went about your extensive research into Islamic societies. And I'm going to just ask a question about, at the age of 17, what was that initial fascination which led you to pack your bags up, go to Cairo and learn Arabic? I just wanted you to paint that scene for us, that very initial spark of inspiration.
Yeah, that's a very lovely question. Thank you. I think I'm going to blame or credit my father, who was born in Beirut in 1938. His parents had left Europe to escape the coming war. And I'd grown up really with my father traveling regularly to the Middle East, whether it was Lebanon or Libya, Syria, a number of other countries. And so it was always this slightly mysterious, latent, hidden atmosphere or background in the household. And by the time I got to 17, I was desperate to leave the UK, finished exams, and Cairo seemed like the best possible place to go and learn Arabic. And if only I'd stuck with it, which was my biggest mistake, I think. But it was a fantastic summer, introduction to the Arab world on my own, and I've always loved the region ever since.
And yes, as you say, you've been around ever since. I mean, next time we want you to join us at the festival. That's I think definitely. I know that you have been at the sister festival, the Emirates Festival of Literature. So certainly in Abu Dhabi. And hearing about those past motivations from Justin, let's go to the theme of this session. And if I can bring in Omar at this point, I love that the organisers have come up with this title, Back to the Future, from Mecca to Mars. And it invites us really to look ahead. Omar, of course, this year the world has witnessed the UAE enter the history books, with the Hope probe becoming the first Arab interplanetary mission, and also marking how the UAE is the 5th country ever to enter Mars's orbit. On the eve of this game-changing event in February, you wrote this wonderful article in Arab News, which, if I may quote your words to you right now, the timing is no coincidence. Hope will reach Mars in the year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of our founding in 1971. Yeah. The Hope probe is the perfect symbol for a nation that has also traveled a great distance in a very short time. In just 5 decades, we became a modern, dynamic hub that plays an important role on the regional and global stages. My question to you is, there was a double whammy, a double win, when the world's eyes was on the UAE. Tell us a little bit about who was the helm of your space program and the idea of how this wonderful success story of space exploration and gender equality married in one.
So can I rename this session from the Emirates to Mars? Mecca is outside of the Emirates, so I don't think we have any claim there.
We can speak to the organisers about that.
Yeah, and it also suggests that, you know, we've gone from Islam to something else. Excuse me on that. We've got the space program. It started in 2014, leadership of the Prime Minister and ruler of Dubai. He was the one who had the idea, and the idea was to actually sort of galvanize youthful energy in the country and to spark off an interest in the sciences amongst younger people. There's also a huge economic incentive as well. There is an understanding of the link between advanced technologies and being a strong economy. So there's no denying that there is an economic incentive as well. Somebody told me recently that without any specific incentives being put in place, there were 50 different companies based just in Dubai working on space applications. Wow. So that's kind of an example of how the Emirates has operated as a hub without necessarily knowing what it is that is going on in the local economy. I think that's one of the strengths of the Emirates. And it gives us this possibility of taking further ideas like space and space exploration. The team is a mostly Emirati team. Obviously, it couldn't have been done without the help of, you know, sort of NASA experts and so on. But there was a very specific idea that we shouldn't buy it off the shelf, that we should actually build it. So I know that the young lady who ran the operation and is now responsible Minister of State for Advanced Technology, Sara Al-Amiri, a remarkable woman, very, very well organized, very, very scientific in her approach, managed to put together a team that really did create this Mars probe. It's exciting because it also links us up with global questions. The Mars probe is meant to be studying the atmosphere of Mars, and that'll have implications for the way in which we understand the Earth's atmosphere. And it's a sign that you know, at least one government in the Arab world is interested in working on global problems where there's no specific direct interest. It's not a parochial issue. And we're sharing all of the information that comes out of that exploration. So if you look at the program, there are a whole bunch of things that are kind of knock-on effects. There's the sciences are now being taught in the universities. There are all kinds of collaborations taking place. There are boot camps for young kids to get an idea of what exactly is going on and to really create more credibility around it, because, you know, for many people it's just an announcement in the papers. It was an event on TV. This is pulling kids in to actually see what it is that fellow Emiratis are engaged in. So in that sense, it's an inspiration for kids. And it's also it provides an attraction for it provides a kind of a magnet for other enterprises involved in space exploration and commercialization.
I think you're absolutely right. The word that you used to sum this up, inspiring. Only last year at the Sister Festival for this Abu Dhabi International Fair, I had the chance of interviewing the first Emirati astronauts.
Yeah.
Inspiring gentlemen, and of course the kids in the audience who were lining up to ask the questions. We actually had the kids come on stage. I was like, I'll just go and get a coffee because these kids are doing a better job of doing the interview. And it was just wonderful, and I think you're absolutely right. To be fair to the organisers deciding the theme of today, Justin is the person who qualifies for the part of the Mecca in the theme, because of course Justin, in his extensive research, has researched, certainly for this book, we've got the Islamic empires, 15 cities that define a civilization, and Mecca is part of it. So he's the from Mecca to Mars equation here. And Justin, just picking up on that theme about progress, I love the fact that you chart it through history. Now you gallop through 15 centuries, selecting 15 cities. I'm going to ask you the impossible question of trying to sum up the book, probably in about 15 seconds now. But this idea, it would just be wonderful for you to illuminate us about the fact that progress in the Arab world is not a new phenomena. In fact, you know, you've showcased the golden age in the Middle East and across Central Asia, a period of cultural, economic and scientific flourishing brought about by the value that Islam placed on education and the importance of acquiring knowledge. From your research, give us a bit of a taste, a bit of a flavour of some of the surprising facts that you came away with.
Well, I remember when I first started researching the book, and I was looking for various ideas to write a history within the Middle East and the wider Muslim world. And it was at a time when, you know, every single bit of news coming out in the media was doom and gloom, from Syria, the war there, and in Iraq, Libya again. It was all desperately, you know, negative coverage. And I thought there's much more to say about this than, you know, terrorism and wars and crises and economic retrenchment and so on. And I thought that it would be interesting to review the region through some of the high points and some of the low points, but looking at these cities as beacons of intellectual civilization across the ages. And so I went from city by city, from the beginning of Islam in Mecca in the 7th century, ending in Dubai and your neighbor Doha, via all sorts of other cities in interesting periods of their evolution. You know, from Damascus under the Great Umayyads, then into Baghdad, the Abbasids. And I think a recurrent theme among many was the importance of tolerance, the living together more or less peacefully of mixed communities, frequently Jews, Muslims, Christians, and a sense of great inquiry and openness to the outside world. And these cities, and you could possibly argue Islamic civilization writ large, was always more successful when it was open and tolerant and inquisitive. And I think that was a common theme throughout the book, whether it's, you know, 19th century Beirut, 12th century Cairo, 10th century Cordoba, and I used your neighbor Dubai for the story of the Maktoums, Build It and They Will Come, which was an incredibly successful story, along with the wider Emirates, you know, from a very low base to our talk today when we're discussing the mission to Mars, you know, unfathomable progress within a really short time. And I wonder if I could be cheeky, Amandeep, for a moment and nick your role for a second and ask Omar a question.
Oh.
You may.
Do I have no choice in the matter?
I think you have no choice, Omar. It's very good to meet you, by the way.
Likewise.
And the question would be, you know, we're talking about, is this a golden era for the Arab world? And I wonder whether I could ask you, can you see any other Arab country outside the UAE doing what it's doing with your mission to Mars?
Sorry, the question is, could I see any other Arab country sort of replicating essentially what we're doing here?
Exactly. I mean, is it fair to say that's unfathomable?
To be honest, I'm fairly optimistic. I don't think that what we've done here is magic. I mean, I suppose there is an element of it, but actually, if you're an optimist for the entire region, if we could just live and let live a little, perhaps not impose our own view of the world on each other, then I don't see why the whole of sort of North Africa couldn't blossom and flourish. And also the fact is that a lot of the Arab world is a set of cities. It's not like we're dispersed over huge territories. So we're actually concentrated in cities, and cities are much easier to manage, I'd say, than sort of heavily populated countryside. So and the other thing is that the Emirates actually has it provides an example of what you can do. You don't need to be a genius in order to run a country properly. And in fact, there are systems that will allow you to run a country properly even if you aren't a genius. So I think that's what we've discovered here, that with a bit of modesty regarding our own abilities, that we can actually achieve much more than sort of great theoreticians of social progress can achieve. So, and I also know that the Emirates, particularly through the Prime Minister's office, has taken a lot of what they've learnt in administration and bureaucratic management and is now providing that kind of expertise below the radar to other countries in the area. There is a bit of sensitivity in making these things public, not on our side, but on the side of other countries. But I know for a fact that actually countries are reaching out to us and saying, well, look, how can we take your expertise and make it ours? And I also spoke to some of the people in the Prime Minister's office about this. This idea that Western consultants come into our countries and sort of give us all this advice and then disappear and allow us to live the consequences. Well, Dubai admits, or the guys in Dubai admit that, actually they're women, so the women in Dubai admit that initially there was a lot of sort of Western consultants working in the Emirates. However, their intention was always to take those mechanisms, structures of approach and systems and make it their own. And so actually now they've kind of pushed aside all of those consultants and learned from them and have developed their own systems, which I think is actually a great sign of progress and confidence in one's own abilities. So yes, I think actually a lot of parts of the Arab world could do better, and it's not magic. How about you? What do you think?
Well, I'm feeling rather less optimistic than you. I think of course it's not magic. But in some ways, the UAE does feel a little bit like magic when you look at the states of the politics and sometimes the economies of some of the other countries, whether it's down to governance or a rather more conservative approach than the UAE has adopted to science and intellectual inquiry. I don't really know, but I think for me, one of the UAE, it's no surprise that it's the UAE that is taking the lead in this field. If you'd said, it was Morocco or Mauritania or Sudan, I'd be rather more surprised. But the Gulf, I suppose, is also in a much stronger position economically to do something like this. But again, why the UAE rather than Saudi Arabia or some of your other neighbours? To me, it's an example of that really restless spirit of inquiry and desire to achieve, and the desire maybe also to put the UAE on the map as the rulers have done in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. A sense of pride, a belief in one's future and destiny, and then as you say, it's not magic; it can be done.
Yeah. May I just add one other thing? I think if you look at leadership in the Emirates as a whole and in each individual emirate, there is a sense of trusteeship, a sense of loyalty to a territory that was under attack over many, many years. And there's a sense of loyalty to the founders of the Emirates as well. And so the Emirates being such a, in terms of the Arab world, a brilliant example of unity and flexibility, the new generation of leaders, the sons of the founders of the Emirates, want to make sure that they also live up to their fathers' legacies. That's a very, very important, I think, motivator as well.
I think absolutely, and I think... Sorry, I'm interrupting you. I'll be quiet now. I was just going to actually reiterate a point that you both made, and perhaps if we can expand on it. One of the key elements to this success story is pluralism. You've both talked about this. Justin mentioned that kind of open and welcoming society as someone who does now call the UAE her home, and this idea that actually as a resident you are made to feel welcome and to be part of society. I know, Omar, you talked about this in that article earlier this year. You mentioned how building a nation on the principles of tolerance, openness and acceptance has paid rich dividends in the UAE in every sense. Ours is one of the most diverse populations in the world, with people of many different nationalities and religions living, working and worshipping side by side. People, especially young people, and I think this is a really interesting point to make here, from all over the world want to make the UAE their home, to build a better life for themselves, with it being rated the region's top country to live and work in for the 9th year running, according to the Arab Youth Survey. And that survey, which just came out last year, was very illuminating in that sense. But this idea of pluralism, this idea of living side by side, it's a rarity, I would say. It's something which is akin to my home city, London, but it certainly isn't the case. And I'm sure Justin, sitting in Norfolk, will be able to put some insight into it as well. It's not a UK-wide phenomena, but this like multinational, multicultural society that the UAE, certainly a place like Dubai, has been able to foster. I wonder if you could speak to that, Omar, by design or by magic?
Well, firstly, thank you for quoting me. It makes me feel very wise. And I try to remember when I wrote those words, but I'm sure I did.
February.
The Emirates has always relied on outsiders. It's always relied on connectivity with the rest of the world. And I was doing a bit of research for the novel that I am completing, which you may ask me about.
This is exclusive.
Yeah, this is exclusive. Yeah.
We'll come on to this.
Now, I was wondering how wealthy the Emirates were individually. I went back to 1965, Dubai. Even though, if you look at photos of Dubai at the time, it was a bit of a village. It was the 3rd largest transshipment point for gold in the world. And for me that was mind-boggling, because we still didn't really have an educational system in the Emirates. And I was researching this because my father in 1965 had to get a Soviet scholarship to study. And so it's just interesting to understand how connected Dubai already was, and yet how disconnected we were in certain senses. So I didn't realize that.
Well, maybe this is because they're anticipating the great exclusive that we're going to be able to share with our audience here and our audience online. I'm going to put down my questions and put my breaking news journalist hat on and ask the exclusive about this new book. I really want to hear it. We will, of course, talk about your first book, but this was very much factual storytelling.
Yeah.
But a novel.
My apologies. I didn't mean to spring this on everybody, but I'm finally going to reveal that I'm almost completing my novel, which is a fictionalized account of my father's last day. He wakes up at 6 in the morning. He goes through the day, and by 12, for those who don't know, he died just after noon, 25th of October 1977. And what happens in the 6 hours or so that he spends, he reminisces about different things. He doesn't know what's going to happen, obviously. But he goes to the beach in the morning, which is what he used to do. First thing in the morning, he'd go for a quick swim, because it was our house was a couple of hundred meters away from the beach. Then he'd come and see us, then have breakfast, and head off to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so what I get to do in the novel is to imagine what it must have been like on that last day, and I get to look at the world in 1977, in the Emirates in 1977. But also, he participated in the issue of the islands that were invaded by Iran in 71 or so. Trips to see the Shah of Iran, his own sort of education in Bahrain and in Iraq. In 1958, he was kicked out of Iraq after spending a month in jail there for having participated in the sort of communist uprising. And it just gets me, sort of able to put some color into a story that should be of interest.
It sounds fascinating. It definitely has piqued our interest.
Well,
and just to
I expect you to buy a copy, yeah?
I want a signed copy. Just to bring our audience up to speed, just in case they don't know the background to the story, sadly your father was assassinated at Abu Dhabi airport
Yeah.
in
1977, yeah.
So this is piecing together the day up to that.
Yeah, essentially it's trying to put together the story of what exactly happened. But not just that, the story of his life, because there are huge chunks that I don't know. He spent 5 years in Dusseldorf, for example, and the only thing that we have is an address. So, you know, I spoke to the construction, the engineering company that he worked for there. Unfortunately, they destroyed all of their records up until, you know, 1970. But it gives me kind of a certain amount of release in trying to imagine what he went through and the kinds of issues he had to deal with. And as you know, I also work in the same place that he worked in, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I work with some of the same people that he worked with. So I get to reflect on, you know, what one's priorities should be or should have been as a diplomat or as a government employee in the modern Arab world.
And of course, as life has come round full circle and you're working there, you're able to do that first-hand research and speak to them, the colleagues that worked with him, and also I imagine family members, people who knew him from back in the day. So I guess what we're all eager to know is, when do we anticipate this book might be released out into the world?
Well, that depends on Isabel. As soon as she buys the rights for $1 million.
We can negotiate. I can anticipate there's going to be auctions. Yeah. We can certainly do a little offline negotiation on behalf of Your Excellency in that respect. Justin, I'm just going to ask you, there was a point at which you referred to this in one of your last questions. You talked to us about the motivation behind some of your work, about challenging the simplistic, narrow perception of the Middle East, about Islam, sadly still in Western media, but and beyond as well. There was a wonderful TED talk that you gave a couple of years ago. I'm going to leave it to you, so less of me and more of you speaking, to give us the premise behind this, and because I just think it really sums up an insight into what motivates you.
Gosh, I don't think I've thought about that for a few years at least. Was it something about laughing at terrorists?
Yes.
Well, that was born of an idea that I think really just how ludicrous the idea was to go somewhere and blow yourself up, thinking that was going to bring you or your family, your country, your followers, great benefits and great honour. And that, there are lots of earnest countering violent extremism programs all over the world. I'm not sure how well they actually work in practice. Dealing with an idea that these sorts of people have is, I think, proving incredibly difficult. And I just had an idea that actually humour seems to be the one thing that they appear to be lacking. Taking themselves very seriously, filming themselves with lovely, beautifully groomed beards, AK-47, the black flags. It's all very earnest and, in my mind at least, incredibly open to be parodied and satirized. So the talk was really about that. I'm not saying that humor is necessarily the answer at all, but I think we should probably try everything, and poking fun at these people who do obviously gain a very large online following and try and poison the minds of young people all over the world. I think exposing the ridicule of their mission seemed to be something worth exploring in my mind. And can I just quickly add, because I haven't had the chance to congratulate Omar on his new novel, which I very much look forward to reading.
Thank you.
Say separately how much I admired and enjoyed Letters to a Young Muslim, which I had the privilege of reviewing. It was just like a blast of fresh air and a very new way of looking at the region, which was, for me at least, absolutely music to my ears.
Thank you very much.
It was so interesting discussing how you said, why are the male role models in many families always the warrior, and not the poet, scholar, so many, the educated teacher, whatever it may be, but it was always the warrior, and I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much. And Justin, I was going to ask you a question. I was going to hold myself back, but now that you've done all this research, there is a kind of a background question in a lot of people's minds. Perhaps they haven't fully verbalized it. Is success in the Muslim world because of Islam or in spite of Islam? I have to admit, I heard somebody ask that question a few years ago on CNN, I believe it was, and it's kind of pestered me. Yeah?
Gosh, that's a very difficult question. But I think I imagine that we have quite a few ideas about that. And in one of my answers, I think, would be whether it's Islam or Christianity or Judaism, the religion that we see in any one country is typically shaped by I'm going to say men and women, but in all too many cases, it's shaped by men. So I would imagine, and I'm not any great expert, but the Islam one sees in the UAE is extremely different from the Islam where I've just come back from overnight. In Mali, for example, where it's blended with animist traditions, and in your other neighbor, Saudi Arabia. There was a very interesting, maybe this is probably too controversial to go into now, but there was a parallel drawn between the sort of Islam in Saudi Arabia and what IS believes in, with similar application of law and so on. So I think the regimes, the ideologies, the politicians seem to me to play an enormous, maybe even a disproportionate role in shaping how Islam, but equally the other religions as well. Look at Christian fundamentalists in the southern US, who are, I think, by any criteria, extremists, with their very strange views about Israel, Christianity, and so on and so forth. So, UAE, Muslim country, tremendous scientific and economic, political progress, versus, sadly, rather too many other countries in the region, Syria. Iraq, for me, is one of the great tragedies, which was, when I was looking at the 9th century in particular, fantastic center of world civilization, the leading city really in the world, reduced over centuries by lots of sectarian strife. And it should also be added enormous amounts of very damaging, destructive Western intervention as well. And I think, the West's role in the Middle East is something that, it shouldn't be ignored at all. It should be brought center stage, and I think that has an awful lot to answer for as well. But I think that could be your third book, Omar, maybe the Islam helpful or not for development.
You give me the outline and I'll write it. Thank you.
And then another $1 million from Isabel, please.
I think next time we need to get Isabel on stage, because she's actually the connector and the inspiration behind our celebration of culture and literature and progress here. Two quick observations. I think it's really interesting, Justin, that you mentioned Baghdad there. I really enjoyed reading about 9th century Baghdad in your book, and you described it as the greatest city on earth in the 9th century. And also when you talk about Damascus, one of the places I wish I could have traveled to, of course now you talk about it at a time when it was just seen as a paradise, and the UN has just recently called it tragically an apocalypse. And the rise and fall, I think that's a remarkable time travel that you take us on. There's also, this book feels like it's a travel wish list. I will be asking later the impossible question to pick your favorites, but I'm just going to also pick up on a point that you made about Omar's book, and of course he's very modest and he very quickly deflected off the compliment. Let's just take a moment to reflect on just how groundbreaking this was when you wrote it, Omar. It's refreshing how you have engaged with the bold and brave questions here. Did you feel a sense that you had to, I know you wrote it in the height of the ISIS threat, did you feel a sense of speaking that you had to speak up, and did you face any backlash in doing so?
So I feel like the ground is opening up and swallowing me, by the way. So
in a good way, I hope. We can put a net over the ground.
I did write the book as a reaction to what was happening in the region with the rise of Islamic State. I'd actually started writing a lot of notes to myself earlier. and it was only later that I began to think that it might be possible to put a book together. I felt an obligation to say something, and I'd said some things in public at talks. I wanted to put something on paper that I couldn't later kind of backtrack from or deny. I also wanted young people to have something in their hands that they could hold on to. So I didn't expect many people to buy it. I do like the cover. It's beautiful turquoise blue, right? And it gives me a great deal of pride to have done it. But did I face any backlash? No. And I'm assuming that's because nobody read it.
I only asked that very leading question because this idea of encouraging critical thinking, you put forward the premise that you can be a Muslim but still have doubts. And coming at a time when it did in 2017, it's a very refreshing ethos that you're encouraging. You're a very refreshing role model, figurehead, thought leader here in this country, and of course a representation that you provide for the UAE internationally. I guess that's why I'm asking about the backlash, because as Justin and I know, working deeply in the journalism sphere, one only has to voice one's opinion for suddenly that opinion to be dissected by people who perhaps aren't even critics, but it just gets dissected. So I guess that's the question. And of course people did read it.
So, either nobody read it and therefore didn't have anything to disagree with, or those who read it agreed with every word. So you choose which.
We can put a vote to the audience. And I did tantalize people with that question. The impossible question to you, Justin, this is like asking you to choose your favorite child. Out of your 15 cities, which one was your favorite city if you had to pick them? And I will hand over the book to Amar so he can give us his verdict. You can pick two, because I've picked two out of the 15, Justin. Justin, what's your response?
Well,
are you allowed to do this?
I'd like to do what I work on training with in media and communications, and advise the people being interviewed to deflect immediately, to say that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked me that, and I think I'm pretty much going to go for all 15. If you pressed me, there's so many of them are my favorite cities. Cairo, Fez, Damascus, Baghdad, Kabul, incredibly good fun. Tripoli, which has so many family connections. Ditto Beirut. So I can't settle on one or two. Samarkand.
I think you just rattled off the whole content list there, but that's allowed because you're the author and you get away with that.
Two of them, sadly, I wasn't able to visit. Mecca, because I'm not Muslim, and I still haven't made it yet to Isfahan, which I would absolutely love to do one day. But they're my favorite cities.
I'm going to quickly ask you a quick follow-up question to that. So Mecca, when you wrote about it, and as you say, you couldn't visit it, what was the methodology behind your research? Because of course you're a very well-travelled travel journalist, you've been based in so many countries, post-conflict, Afghanistan, Iraq. It's so enviable, your track record. But with that particular city, how did you feel reporting on it, so to speak, from, of course, an outsider's perspective in a complete sense?
Yes, and this time I'm not going to deflect that question and say that it actually was quite uncomfortable because to write about somewhere with no experience of the place for me is very unusual and awkward. Increasingly these days one gets accused of whether cultural appropriation. Who are you to write about my country, my city, my civilization, my religion? That's one thing. But to actually do something on Mecca, which is so important in the story of early Islam and Islam, writ large, was very uncomfortable. So lots of secondary sources, lots of contemporary reports, friends who'd been on pilgrimage with their own, feelings. What was the Hajj like? And an awful lot of history as well. So, and reportage in terms of recent architectural developments and the growth of Mecca into something, quite extraordinary and huge. So. Yeah, I regretted that I wasn't able to go. I still would love to. I did look into, was it possible to receive official approval, but it was looking quite difficult. So, yeah, slightly uncomfortable, Amandeep, I think, on that one.
But I appreciate you engaging with that question and giving us a very open and honest answer, because I think it's important for us to have that type of insight. So I appreciate that, Justin. You've got such an enviable track record and such an extensive insight into the Middle East and Islam as well. So having that contextual answer from you there, maybe the book might actually secure some future permissions. So, you know, you've heard it here first, so you never know. And we would love to get your follow-up to that. I think I've given Omar enough of a chance to go through the 15 cities list. The first question, Omar, is, have you been to all 15? Second question is, okay, your favorite.
I haven't been to many of these places. Oh. However, I have chosen 2 cities on the basis of your chapter titles. One is Fez, the Athens of Africa. That appeals to me very much. And the next one is Constantinople, city of the world's desire. Very exciting.
So you overlap with me with Istanbul, and the other one would have to be Beirut, because it's just such a fabulous city, and it's tragic what the country and the city has been going through recently. Justin, on that point, give us an insight into the fact that you mentioned your father's born in Beirut, and in researching the Islamic empires, you actually learnt of a grandmother and a connection to the country. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, maybe that's something I could look into for another book one day. But because I do have relatives there.
Well, you can give us an exclusive into that new book.
Well, you know, in many parts of the region, I think we would expect to find people that have never moved, and I wonder whether that might be the same in a village in Mount Lebanon, somewhere. I think there will be family relatives that I know nothing about. I think there's a Maronite Christian community. I haven't made contact, and I just know the name of the village, which, because it's quite early in the UK today, I've already forgotten. But I think, yeah, I completely agree with what you said about Beirut and the tragedy of what's happening now. But I think the poet Nadia Toueni, who wrote in French, said, you know, Beirut was, you know, died 1,000 times and will always be reborn, or something like that. Mille fois revécu. So I hope we can take some comfort that that great city, which has borne such tragedy and destruction in recent years, will rise again. My father, I remember, always, you know, being terribly saddened by the 1975 to 1990 civil war. At least lived to see it rise again, and you know, tragically, as we speak, it's on its knees yet again.
And we wish all the success for Beirut and Lebanon to rise again. On that point, I'm just going to don my journalistic hat for just a moment, because I have asked His Excellency whether he'd be happy to bring us up to speed with the UAE's position now with the circumstances in Gaza. And of course, our heartfelt thoughts and prayers go to everyone affected on both sides of that ongoing crisis. Now, Omar, you were in that wonderful hand-selected delegation that went to the White House last September, signed the Abraham Accords, a historic moment. How would you envisage that journey that's happened since September, bringing us up to speed with what's happening now?
Right. Well, on the relationship between Israel and the Emirates, things seem to be moving ahead just in the way we expected. I don't think at any stage did we expect for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to be solved or resolved simply because we signed a peace treaty. It isn't a surprise that things have sort of erupted in the way they did. And our foreign minister has called on restraint on both sides. We don't have any particular loyalties to the Israelis just because we signed a peace treaty with them. We still stand with the Palestinian people. We still stand for justice of the Palestinian people. But there's a limited amount that we can actually do. There are players who are much closer to the parties, including Egypt, Jordan. And the Qataris as well. They have a superb relationship with Hamas in Gaza. And so what we can say is that we simply want the violence to stop. Will it affect our relationship with the Israelis? No, because this is a strategic relationship that we have spent a lot of political capital on. We will continue to work to maximize the benefits that we envisage from that relationship.
Well, Your Excellency, I really appreciate you openly engaging with that question. I have so many more follow-up questions for both of you, but for this moment I will share the stage and share the time with the audience. I've just been handed some questions that have been submitted. So the first question says, does the UAE's sense of collective responsibility and long-term planning make it better suited to settling on Mars than any other country? I think that's for you.
No, I think that's for Justin, no?
But we can all forecast the appropriateness of which nation. But what do you think? The collective responsibility and long-term planning, does it put the UAE in a better position to colonize Mars?
Yeah, I think we're against colonization in general.
That was my word, that's not the audience member said.
Perhaps help develop Mars with the permission and the acceptance of the Mars population.
Okay, and the next question for the audience, I really appreciate these. How will the UAE develop given that women are increasingly employed in influential positions? I mean, they didn't say this, but are you scared that you might be booted out, Your Excellency?
Yeah. I report to a number of women. They're all, well, I have to now be politically correct and bureaucratically correct. They're all brilliant women, and I will follow all of their instructions.
Put it on record now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you know, it's not a secret that women in the Emirates have taken the lead in many different places in many different ways. There's certainly, you know, on the Mars project, a majority of scientists were women and are women. You know, who knew that women were going to be more motivated than the Arab male? But that's the way it is.
We'll let you end on that very diplomatic note, ever the diplomat. I'm going to open the floor up to the audience here. People got questions for Justin or for Your Excellency? Please do hold your hand up. Well, we'll come back to you because I've still got many, many more questions to ask. Justin, I was going to ask, when it came to writing your particular books and choosing your topic areas, because your latest book, Arab Conquest, you go back to the 6th and 7th century. How does one decide which century to delve into? What's your kind of like trigger point?
Well, thank you, Amandeep, for giving me the opportunity to mention the new book, which is just coming out now, I think this month actually, in the UK, the Arab Conquest.
We're still waiting for a hard copy to make it out here, so yes.
Hopefully I can come out one day and join you and discuss that at a great length if possible. But I was it's sort of going backwards in time really from the earlier research, but it is to try to understand what is really very difficult to understand, the explosive surge of warriors from the Arabian Peninsula across vast tracts of land. And so between the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 to the overthrow of the Umayyads in 750, that's just 118 years, which utterly changed the world forever, I think, with Islam moving from what some historians would say initially at least was an obscure cult limited to a very few numbers of people in the Arabian Peninsula to a global religion. So an extraordinarily quick and rapid, militarily impressive, politically astute, setting up an empire in incredibly short order. And you know, much of that region obviously has never looked back. Damascus has never not been Muslim since the Arab conquests. So it was really just a search, I suppose, to how it all began, including the life of the Prophet Muhammad as what I think is an exemplar of conquest, and the sort of the fusion of political and religious authority, you know, sword-bearing leader of armies, and to try to understand those very early days of Islam, which are often idealized as well in the early caliphates, but tremendously impressive, you know, to go to the Atlantic on one side and into the mountains of Central Asia on the other, while maintaining unity. So that was really what that new attempt was to do. And you said, how do I know which centuries to go? I would say it was triggered with that landmark death of the Prophet Muhammad, having established the earliest signs of conquest within the peninsula, which I think then his successors took onto the broader geographical stage.
And I think having looked at an earlier version of an e-version, the illustrations that you include in Arab Conquest are just so beautiful. It reminded me of one of the photos that you have in Islamic empires, 1975, the Dubai Creek back then. So I think that wonderful way of kind of setting the atmosphere, making it atmospheric and evocative for the reader is so important, especially, of course, if we talk about the 6th and 7th centuries, the portraiture that you use in that. And what I really enjoyed in your writing style, Justin, you're such a prolific writer, because of course there's a book coming out almost every single year, that you write history with a present tense at times as well. So it's that kind of journalistic reportage style. It's very inspiring for someone like me who's only ever written in a kind of factual journalistic sphere to be inspired by people like you and by Omar as well, who's switching from writing his factual book to writing this novel now, which I know is inspired by a real story, but that kind of fictional style. I wondered if you could give us an insight, Omar, in terms of which parts of the brain that you feel like you need to engage in when you write those two different.
To be honest, I actually think that was a bit of fiction as well. There's a lot of maybes and perhapses and what's ifs, what ifs.
The what ifs are staying with you and staying with the idea of literature and how you have been a philanthropist in the arts. You sponsor the Saif Gabash, named after your father, Bannable Prize for Arabic Literary Translation.
Yeah.
And you're a founding trustee of the International Prize for Arabic Fiction in collaboration with the Man Booker Prize in London.
Yeah.
Linking into the central theme of this festival, the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair is of course sponsored by and supported here in hosting this festival by the Arabic Language Centre. Give us an insight in terms of the process of promoting the Arabic language. What's happening right now? Is there anything new, any new trends that we need to look out for? How healthy is that translation market?
Wow, that's fascinating. Justin, can I ask, was there any connection between the progress of these different cities and the mix of languages that they were interacting with?
You have deflected the question, but I'll allow that.
Crikey. Omar, thank you for that. I think that's something I probably have paid completely inadequate attention to. I look more, especially I think, at the mix of peoples, ethnicities, and certainly religions. I think languages were, I'm thinking about Kabul now, under the Emperor Babur, descendant of Timur, where there were numerous languages in play. That was an outlier for my book, which is mostly, not exclusively, but mostly Arab cities. Obviously, Constantinople, Istanbul, another one where there were many languages spoken. Most of these cities had Jewish communities, so there would be that, Hebrew as another language. But I think Arabic, in a way, was the linguistic unifier.
Yeah.
And in the book I've just finished, I think that for me one of the great legacies of the Arab conquests, apart from introducing Islam to the world, was that the linguistic legacy of classical Arabic really being written across the world, which I think is fascinating. And whatever one may think about political unity within the Arab world having proved elusive, for me one of the great cultural unities is this beautiful, hypnotic, incredibly difficult language, which I've completely failed to master, which is Arabic.
Thank you, Justin, for answering the question that I actually put to Omar, but thank you very much for engaging that, giving us that historical context. And I'm just going to say that for when you get your hands on the Islamic empires, you mentioned Babu the Conqueror there. Justin, there's a little bit of an in-joke, because he writes a letter to his son, doesn't he? And there's, not so much parallels with Omar's book about letters to a young Muslim. I would just say that it's just an interesting little springboard point there. We are going to wrap up now, but I'm going to give the last
two words about the Arabic language. What sometimes worries me is that when we give focus to something, it's because the moment has already passed. So when we give focus to the Arabic language, it's a recognition that our own children are now speaking English as a first language. And there's a worry there. And you know, sort of generation after, well, not generation after generation, but year after year, I see a new sort of set of books coming out to teach kids Arabic and sort of, you know, engage their minds, and then the project is dropped. I mean, most of these are private initiatives. It worries me that my first language is English. I think in English, and I will then translate into Arabic. What is happening with the Arabic language? Is it still the active language of thought, or is it something that we want to preserve because we want to preserve an identity? In preserving that identity, will we be disqualifying people from the job market if they don't speak English perfectly fluently? And the Emirates as a global hub is actually becoming a place where English is more important than any other language, simply in order to participate in the global economy. So I'm a big enthusiast for all of the books that I see here. I spotted Spinoza in one of the Syrian bookshops here, which kind of surprised me, and I'm completely in favor of translation. I support translation. But how much of these books mean something? How many of these books are produced only to die as soon as they are bought by somebody, or how many of these books actually begin to have an influence on the discussions that we have in Arabic?
I think those are such profound questions. We can certainly roll on our session for another hour, but it's still very early in the UK, so we are going to release Justin to his day, and it's still relatively early here in Abu Dhabi. That does draw our session today to a close, and I want to thank you, our audience that have joined us here today, the audience online, and of course I want to say thank you to the Arabic Language Centre, we just talked about them there, for organising this book fair, the AV team, the translators, all the volunteers, and of course the wonderful, wonderful organisers of this festival. It's not easy putting on a festival during a pandemic, but people like Isabel, Abdul and her team, Carmel, Kathy, Marianne, Soha, everybody's been pulling together and making it happen. And of course the key ingredient that we need for that is our wonderful speakers, virtual and in person, to give up their time and give us an insight into their awe-inspiring work. So please join me in saying thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Isabel and team.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emma.